Falling leaves, rising light. Chapter 5, Tiptoeing Home. Jonah learned to move like a man crossing thin ice. After the first slam, the choreography of home changed. Conversations began with tiny offerings. Is this a good time? Do you want me to handle that? Phrases that functioned like soft landings. Jonah walked through the house tuned to invisible tripwires. The placement of keys, the angle of a magazine, the single chair that had to be pulled out just so. He became expert at making himself small in big rooms, at choosing a tone that sounded like honey when bitterness waited to be mistaken for truth. One ordinary Tuesday evening, he came in after a late shift, hands smelling faintly of metal shavings and coffee. The living room smelled of orange oil and laundry soap. Luke was on the couch with a gaming headset, eyes bright with focus. Emma was bent over a laptop at the kitchen table. Sophie, in pajamas 2 sizes too large, built a city of blocks on the rug. For a second, in the warm half-light, the pieces of family fit together like a jigsaw puzzle aligning. He greeted them softly, because loudness had become an invitation to scrutiny. He asked about homework and bus schedules, offered to warm up leftovers, and watched his words land and be accepted as small, pleasant facts. Mara appeared in the doorway carrying a stack of paperwork, and Jonah felt the old muscle memory: select his words, sheath his jokes, make no moves that could be misread as intrusion. He did this not because he liked fear, but because he loved the seams of this life and feared breaking them. Then, without preamble, Mara began to unravel an old interaction. She quoted a conversation that had happened months ago, and reframed it as a pattern of disregard. She spoke with that cool precision that turned the past into indictment. Jonah's chest tightened, the familiar constriction that arrived whenever an old wound was being reopened. He felt the air thin, as if someone had removed pieces from the room and left less space to breathe. He tried to answer gently, offering context and admission where it was needed, but Mara's cadence turned anything he said into an afterthought. Emma's face hardened in a way that made him feel suddenly distant. Luke's shoulders hunched. Sophie's eyes filled with worry. The children, living in the echo chamber of her certainty, folded themselves into her narrative until his explanations sounded like noise against a drum. When the conversation closed with Mara's quiet, final, "I can't keep doing this," Jonah felt the old script begin to play itself: leave, silence, return. He gathered his things more quickly now, certain the phrase would be followed by action. He left with no scene, no dramatic clamor, just a practiced exit that had become almost routine. The door closed behind him with the same bland permanence it had the first time, and the streetlight painted the hood of his car with a thin wash of light. Sleeping in the car had its humiliations but also a clarity. Stripped of the theater of home, his thoughts arranged themselves without the pressure of upstairs voices. He read scripture under the glow of a dashboard lamp and wrote in the margins of his journal small notes that felt like life rafts. He wrote the things he wished had found voice earlier, the times he had tried to speak and been cut off, the tiny mercies he'd offered that were catalogued as negligent, the nights he'd sat listening to Sophie pray over each family member by name and felt both guilt and gratitude in the same breath. What surprised him was not the cold of the air or the cramped seat, but how the silence pressed into him like a question. Why did he keep returning? The answer was not simple: love, responsibility, fear of fracturing the children's world. He would not allow his leaving to be one more wound that fell on their growing. So he returned, again and again, to the small rituals that had once felt like the quiet architecture of a family. The way Luke's hair smelled after a soccer game, Emma's habit of leaving a half-read book by the sink, Sophie's insistence that he tuck her blanket just so. Those were the anchors he clung to. Back inside, he rehearsed a new tactic. He would be present in the ways that mattered, at school events, at bedtime, in the small domestic economies where love was counted and dishes washed and shoes tied. Presence, he hoped, would outlast the narratives. He learned to let some things go: insistence on being right, the need to correct every misremembered detail, the desire for immediate vindication. He practiced quiet endurance, not as a concession but as stewardship of what remained. But endurance wore grooves. each return etched a deeper channel of self-doubt. He began to measure the distance between who he was and who others thought he was. The ledger he kept at night filled with facts and hurts, and also with small proofs of love, an extra pair of socks packed for Luke on a rainy morning, a whispered reassurance to Emma before a test, a silly dance in the kitchen that made Sophie giggle until she choked on her laughter. On one damp evening, after a particularly exhausting day where nothing had gone right, Jonah sat at the kitchen table and allowed himself a grief that had no audience. He let the tears come slow and hot, not dramatic or loud, but steady as a faucet left on. He sat with the ache and tasted it fully, the shame of being misread, the sting of rejection, the tenderness that refused to die. He prayed for durability and for wisdom, and when the tears stopped he felt not healed but honest, a man who knew his limits and his commitments both. Tiptoeing home had become, for now, the cost of keeping the promise he'd made to his children the day they were born. It was humiliating and holy at once, a daily small crucible that burned away vanity and left something more necessary, the resolute patience of a man who would not let the story of his family die without first doing everything he could to keep a light in the window. Falling Leaves, Rising Light. Chapter 6. Architecture of Blame. Mara's cruelty had a blueprint. It was not the single, dramatic strike of a blow but an engineered system of rearranged facts, repackaged memories, and patient repetition that built a case against Jonah brick by brick. She spoke in calm paragraphs that sounded like reason. She staged stories that made his mistakes look elemental and immutable. Over time, the house itself began to reflect her architecture, rooms arranged to show her order, photographs cropped to emphasize moments she chose, conversations steered so that his explanations never fit the frame she'd built. Jonah discovered the subtlety of the work when friends began to tilt away in ways that made his chest ache. At neighborhood barbecues he listened to laughs and shared memories and felt a growing distance as Mara's version of episodes, where he was careless or thoughtless, slid into polite conversation like a slow fog. He found himself defending minor truths against a tide that had the momentum of unanimity. The defensiveness was exhausting, the silence that followed it, heavier. Her technique was careful. She rehearsed the cadence of grievance until it sounded inevitable. She repeated small versions of the same story until doubt about his character seemed ordinary. When Jonah tried to show receipts, calendars, or the plain sequence of events, her responses were patient and precise, an inversion that made objections seem petulant. Her friends, wanting peace and clarity, accepted the simpler narrative. Children are particularly vulnerable to the story told loudest in the house they live in. One afternoon, Jonah pulled into the driveway and found a neighbor on the porch watering geraniums. The neighbor smiled as neighbors do, then, politely, mentioned something Mara had said, an allegation about Jonah's conduct at a recent PTA meeting. Jonah tried to correct the detail gently. The neighbor nodded as if hearing an interesting footnote, and carried the correction away like a loose pebble, not worth weighing. Jonah drove to his garage and held the steering wheel until his hands went numb, the hum of the engine a small, private thunder. He felt the architecture settle around him, enclosing him in an interpretation of self he had not authored. Inside the house, small domestic things became evidence in Mara's hands. A forgotten text became proof of irresponsibility. A missed anniversary dinner was reinterpreted as disregard. She curated scenes to support her claims, leaving the door open to overhear a private frustration, repeating an old complaint at precise moments, leaning close to the children to whisper a corrective that made him appear absent. Jonah watched, helpless, as his life was edited and then played back to him in a montage that made his character seem thin. The children's faces changed in proportion to Mara's retelling. Emma's eyes, once quick with mischief, now catalogued disappointments with the expression of someone auditing a ledger. Luke learned the language of dismissal and used it like armor. Sophie, young and bewildered, echoed her mother's small verdicts with the unintentional cruelty of a child mimicking grown certainty. Each phrase Mara taught them stuck like resin. Jonah's attempts to reframe or to offer context sounded defensive in the echo chamber she'd built. Jonah tried to fight with paperwork, with calendars, with small proofs of intent and care. He copied emails, kept logs, left notes the way a conscientious worker might leave instructions for a successor. Those records comforted him in private but did little in the public theater where reputation is decided by impression rather than list. He discovered the lonely truth about being misrepresented. Truth can be present and still go unheard. The strain showed on him. He grew leaner, not from hardship but from the tightening of vigilance. His laugh came less often and sounded forced when it did. He found himself choosing company carefully, showing up only where his presence mattered and retreating from places where the architecture of blame had already set the panels and shadows. He prayed for endurance and for wisdom, prayers that were at once small and essential. One night, after the children were in bed and the house hummed with the quiet of refrigerators and distant traffic, Jonah went into the attic and opened the old shoebox of letters he had written Mara over the years. The handwriting, his handwriting, felt like relics from another life. Earnest apologies, silly notes, thanks for a shared joke. He sat among those papers and realized how far apart the archives of their marriage had become. Her curated narrative on one shelf, his scattered real moments in boxes he kept alone. The recognition did not bend to anger so much as to sorrow. Sorrow for the slow re-education of his family's memory, and for the way a person can be reframed until he hardly recognizes himself. He resolved then to keep the shoebox near him. Not as a weapon, but as a reminder that the truth existed in the small quotidian acts of love and care, documented not for judgment but for the quiet keeping of his own heart. If the house would be an edifice of accusation, he thought, then let there be a corner, however small, where his truth lived. He would not let the architecture of blame be the only blueprint for how his children learned to understand love or how the neighborhood learned to remember a life. That resolve did not change the day to day. The architecture still functioned, the edits still landed, the children's words still sometimes wound. But Jonah's private record, both the ledger of hurts and the shoebox of small mercies, gave him a steadier ground to stand on. He would continue to show up, to fold clothes, to drive to games, to read late-night stories to Sophie, and to speak gently even when his words might be folded back into accusation. In those ordinary acts he found resistance, not dramatic, but true. The architecture of blame could be clever and patient, but it could not fully erase the quiet counterweight of steadfast love. Falling leaves, rising light. Chapter 7, Neighborly Silence. The first thing Jonah noticed was the way greetings thinned out like worn fabric. Neighbors who had once waved from lawns now offered polite nods that felt like closed doors. Mrs. Hargrove, who baked banana bread and left an extra loaf by their mailbox every Christmas, no longer paused for a chat. Her smile had folded into a small, efficient kindness, a bread on the step, a retreating back turn to the porch. The kids' soccer coach who used to clap Jonah on the shoulder for showing up with practice cones now handed the clipboard to someone else with the same quick, practical gesture one reserves for a favor already decided. It was not overt malice. It was a slow evacuation of intimacy, a massing of civility where warmth once stood. Jonah felt each polite margin as if a room had been painted in cooler tones. In neighborhood conversations about school fundraisers or community gardens, his name came up less as a familiar echo and more as a grain of sand, present but unwelcome in the delicate machinery of belonging. The loneliness that came with that sort of silence was soft but sharp, like cold fingers tracing the ribs. At the grocery store he noticed the cashier's avoidance of eye contact, and the way other customers shifted seats on the deli bench. People made practical arrangements to avoid the awkwardness of being placed in the middle of a story that had already been edited for them. Jonah learned to move through those spaces with a small humility that felt like slow work. Smile, be brief. Do not ask others to bear the weight of his explanations. Pride was a luxury he could not afford. Dignity, he realized, had to be practiced quietly. It hurt in unexpected places. Emma stopped inviting friends over as often, citing new rules about homework and curfews. Luke took longer routes on bike rides that once looped past the house. Sophie asked once, in the small honest way of a child, "Do people not like me because of Daddy?" Jonah folded her into his arms and felt both the fierce love of a father and the raw shame of being the unwelcome subject of whispered corrections. He answered slowly, choosing words like stable stepping stones. Some people are confused, honey. Some people are listening to the wrong story. But I love you always. There were practical consequences as well. A handyman who used to stop by for coffee and advice took on fewer favors. Invitations to neighborhood barbecues came addressed to Mara alone. Jonah watched, from the porch or from the car, as his presence thinned until it felt like a ghost habit rather than a living man. The house that had once been his center became a stage where his role had been rewritten by someone else's script. He mourned small intimacies that disappeared not with a bang but like a light turned down. A neighbor who once offered to watch Sophie for an afternoon now wished them well from a distance. Jonah tried not to let every small retraction feel like a verdict, and yet the accumulation of these small retractions pressed on him. He found himself counting absences as proof of reality. Fewer invites, fewer shared plates, fewer casual check-ins. Still, the neighborly silence revealed a different truth at the edges. There were a few, quiet, steady people, who refused the easy drift. Mrs. Alvarez from across the street brought over her quince jelly without fuss. Pastor Reyes at the small church nodded at Jonah in a way that held neither accusation nor spectacle, simply recognition. These gestures were modest and rare, but they mattered like splashes of color against an otherwise muted wall. They taught Jonah that belonging could be rebuilt, not always in broad strokes but in the patient accumulation of small, honest acts. In the evenings, when the house lights blinked on and the neighborhood settled into its habitual hum, Jonah took longer walks. He walked past yards where children played and porches where conversations flowed, and he noticed how his shadow moved differently now, solitary, careful, keeping distance. He prayed for the neighbors who had retreated, for the ones who still reach, and for the children who watched it all and tried to understand grown things with small hearts. The neighborly silence was a new weather system Jonah had not signed up for, but he learned to live within it and to cultivate the few genuine connections that persisted. He tended those small gardens like a man who had learned the value of careful planting, a joke offered to a tired cashier, a sincere thank you to a man who returned a lost tool, a quiet nod to a woman who exchanged friendly waves. Bit by bit, those tiny refusals of distance began to stitch a different kind of community. One that might still be small, but that, in its steadiness, might yet become enough. Falling Leaves, Rising Light. Chapter 8, Children's Echoes. The house learned new rhythms and the children's voices learned to echo what sounded safest. Jonah began to notice the small ways their speakings had been rewired. Emma no longer laughed the way she used to. Her humor tightened into a sharp retort that cut questions short. She used Mara's phrases with the same measured certainty. "He doesn't get it, that's just how he is, you don't understand." The words landed like evidence, not possibility. When Jonah offered a tentative correction, an aside about context or intent, she would tilt her head and recite the version she'd been given, as if quoting scripture. The distance between them felt both bewildering and deliberate. Luke's defenses were quieter. He learned to vanish into activities where speech wasn't required, late-night drives, hours in the garage, headphones stretched over the world. When he did answer Jonah, it was with clipped practicality, an exchange of logistics rather than heart. Jonah saw the old boy who had once told him secrets about schoolyard crushes and failed science projects retreat into a silhouette of someone who did not afford vulnerability easily. The silence between them widened in inches that felt like miles. Sophie was the smallest, and the most easily swayed. Where she used to leap into his lap with small questions about the sun or a homework problem, she now approached with caution, as if testing the ground. Once, after Mara had quietly repeated an old grievance about Jonah's impatience, Sophie paused in the pantry and asked with wide, honest eyes, "Did Daddy get mad at you when you were little?" Jonah's heart stopped in his chest. There was a tenderness in the question, but also a fear he recognized as the echo of coached narrative. He crouched to her height, smelled the littleness of her hair, and answered softly, telling her the truth that made room for both his failings and his love. It was the accumulation of small echoes that stung most. the preschool teacher who repeated Mara's assessment of Jonah as distant. Charlotte from Emma's class who asked pointed questions about custody as casually as one asks about a math tutor, the way other parents' eyes flicked to Mara in social settings as if awaiting confirmation. Friendships thinned and alliances reformed around the version of Jonah Mara presented. He felt his identity compress under the weight of a narrative he hadn't written. When the children argued among themselves, Jonah could hear the phrasing that came back to him like a chant. "Daddy never listens," Luke would say, not because it was always true, but because the phrase fit the map they'd been handed. Emma, the bluntest of the three, sometimes used more cutting language, sharp enough to make him flinch, then collapse with a guilty tenderness because she'd been taught how to aim. Jonah learned to hold space for their words without answering every accusation. He began to believe that some truths would resurface in time if given the chance, and that his role now was to be steady rather than defensive. Yet there were moments that refused the script, small betrayals of the narrative Mara tried to fix. Luke, one late night, left the car window cracked and sat beside Jonah on the curb for an hour without speaking much, hands warm on the hood. He didn't offer apologies or accusations, only presence, an uncomplicated closeness that felt like an unspoken apology. Sophie once snuck a note into his work bag that simply said, "I love you, Daddy," in big, uneven letters. Emma, on a rare day when the rain kept her home and their schedules aligned, let down her guard long enough to lend him her headphones and listen to a song he'd loved in college. Those small betrayals of the story were islands of grace in an ocean of repeated phrases. Jonah worried constantly about what the children were learning about love and about standing up for truth. He kept trying to teach them a different kind of vocabulary, how to say when they'd been hurt, how to ask for clarification rather than assumption, how to sit in discomfort rather than assigning blame. Sometimes they took the lesson like a seed, other times the moment closed with the practiced finality of a mother's reframed narrative. At school events, he stayed visible without forcing intimacy. He practiced the art of showing up with deliberate gentleness, arriving early to set up chairs so he could help without drawing attention, clapping the loudest at Sophie's small performances, fingers raw from the effort of being wholehearted in public, offering short, sincere congratulations to Emma when she turned in a project. He learned that presence could be a slow persuasion, an argument made by service rather than speech. Sometimes, when the house settled and the kids were asleep and the night felt like a thin skin over the day, Jonah cried. Not theatrical sobs, but small wetnesses that came from the weight of watching his children echo words not yet theirs. He asked God for patience, for a way to stand without pushing, for courage to let time unspool where he could not pull the thread. He asked that truth would find ears when they were ready and that his children would learn that people are more complicated than the stories we tell about them. Toward the end of autumn, those echoes grew louder as school friends and social media amplified slanted stories. Jonah felt the world shrink then expand again in random ways. Closed doors in his neighborhood, surprising kindnesses from a teacher, a late-night text from Luke that read only, "You up?" The oscillation tired him, but it also taught him resilience. He clung to the small concrete proofs of love and hoped the rest would follow in its time. The children's echoes did not feel permanent, but they were powerful. Jonah resolved to stay, not to prove himself in the theater of public opinion, but to be the kind of father whose steady acts outlasted the headlines their home had become. He would keep leaving notes in lunchboxes, showing up for assemblies, whispering bedtime prayers, small depositions of trust that he hoped would outlast the louder editing around them. If Jonah's story resonates with you, hit like so others can discover it too. And subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart.